Tonight's speaker. After graduating with a bachelor's in biology from CSU Northridge in 1973, Dr. Martin Poenie continued his studies at Talbot Seminary. After seminary in 1979, he went to Stanford and obtained a PhD in biology. Subsequently, Dr. Poenie was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. After Berkeley, he came to the University of Texas in 1987. Dr. Poenie was given the Presidential Young Investigator Award from the National Science Foundation, and in 2006 was listed among the ISI highly cited researchers. My introduction to Dr. Poenie was anytime I would post a BBC event on my Facebook, he would reply, "Austin, please." I then began to delve into who this man was and was incredibly impressed that he would even commit to posting "Austin, please" on my Facebook. My funniest memory is someone locally who wanted to compare credentials with Dr. Poenie, spouting that she had a master's degree and she knew what she was talking about. Before Dr. Poenie could reply, I simply published the link to the Poenie Science Lab in UT, and the credential combat stopped. It is an honor to have this gentleman speak. So please welcome, speaking on the topic, a scientific critique of the Genesis creation account, Dr. Martin Poenie.
So are we on? Is it going back? Can you hear me back there? Okay, good. So, yeah, I'm amazed at this place. Such a wonderful place. I think they ought to bring a World of Beer to Austin. We have some good places, but nothing that matches this. It's fantastic. And maybe that way I could actually get Ezra to come to Austin and do this there. So. But, you know, I kept saying, "Austin, please," and what happens? I'm up here. So what I would like to do is first give you a little background. Okay, it's a little weird, but I just put Windows 10 on. So I don't know if that's full screen or not. Okay. So I've been in biology, in fact, to think of it, been at a school my whole life. And I've been at UT Austin almost 30 years now. Time to think about doing something different. But as Ezra noted, I went to seminary before going into science. And, you know, somewhere along the line, I mean, I had read Genesis, the same thing everyone read, the English version of it. And, of course, I knew the science. And I just, somewhere along the line about 1998, decided, well, what do I really think about this? I mean, Genesis doesn't fit at all. In fact, it's much maligned and ridiculed from the scientific perspective. And, you know, I had enough experience to know before I decide what I think about it, I ought to know what it says. I think that's a good idea when you're going to evaluate. And I proceeded to dust off my Hebrew books and rusty and translate the text and work on what it meant and how they wrote. And something happened along the way through that process where I started saying, you know, this seems to me that parallels what I know scientifically. And of course, people would say I'm crazy, right? But as I continued to work on this, I was amazed. You know, I don't know what you'll think, but if you came here to hear a creation versus evolution debate, or just a one-sided debate, you'll be disappointed. That's not what I'm going to do. As I see things from my vantage point, what anytime someone learns that I'm both a scientist and a Christian, the first question inevitably, what do you think about evolution? And that's not really, in fact, what I see is that the religious versus, this is my perception, versus, let's call them the creationists on one side, and the, what we could call them atheists or skeptic or the opposing side, both agree on one thing. They say, if God did it, it would look like magic. And then we have the creationist side trying to say, here's the magic, and the other side trying to say, there is no magic. And these categories don't work for me. I look at things differently. I don't think either side. I think that's a false dilemma there. But what I really wanted to talk about is what the text says and how it parallels what we know from science, okay? And full disclosure, I think the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. I think life, there's a continuity, a history and continuity to life. That life has been molded by mundane events and miraculous events. All sorts of things have entered into the history of life. And I don't see that as not God. I see that as God. Okay. So let's kick it off. And let's start off. I'm just going to walk through Genesis 1. Genesis 2 would be a lot of fun, but it would take too long to do all this. We'll be doing good if we just get through the first chapter. So the first chapter of Genesis starts off with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, that very first word, Bereshith, is a subject of a lot of controversy. I don't want to really go into that right now. I take the traditional translation as correct. And what this says is there was a beginning to the universe. So when this word create, the term is bara, it refers to something new and different from what went before. It doesn't necessarily mean to make it out of nothing. That's entirely consistent, but it doesn't essentially mean that. For example, in the Psalms, it says, this will be written for the generation to come, that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord. So this is bara, this people to be created are new and different because they praise the Lord. But they weren't necessarily then made out of nothing. They are simply a new generation that came from an old generation. So in this, God created the heavens and earth. You'll notice that heavens is plural. That's because they thought of more than one heavens. It's very similar to our word sky, and you can see that birds fly in the sky. We have the sun and moon in the sky. We have stars in the sky, and we understand that they are at different levels, and so did they. Okay? So one heaven is the lower atmosphere. And then when it says God called that lower atmosphere heaven, it used singular. But then there are other heavens. God is in the highest heaven, or in fact, in the Psalms 8, it says even the universe can't contain him. So the second thing we need to know is combining heavens and earth was their way of saying the universe. Everything is included in earth and the three heavens. And what that means for me is that the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars are all made in the beginning. And it's starting off at this point with them all being made, at least to some state of development. So that's going to influence how we think about this. Now, just that little statement that the universe had a beginning is one of the triumphs of modern science. Science did not always think the universe had a beginning, and it didn't like the idea of the universe having a beginning. People fought it. Einstein fudged his equations to try and make it look like the universe wasn't expanding and therefore had a beginning. He later regretted that. But let me read you from an astronomer, Robert Jastrow, God and the Astronomers. He says, for the scientist who's lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak as he pulls himself over the final rock, and he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. The point is that scaling the mountain was the work that it took to show that the universe actually had a beginning. So, one of the ways we know the universe has a beginning is that it's expanding. It's flying apart. Now, it's the expansion of space. We have to kind of get this right. But the picture is that the space is expanding and all the things in it are spreading apart. And the implication is that if it's expanding outward, if you were to turn the clock back, it would all come back together to a point. And that would be the beginning. So, important in this regard, the physicists say that any expanding universe must have had a beginning, which is just simply what the Bible says. But it goes beyond that, because if you look at how the Bible talks about the creation of the universe, it's interesting. There's a dozen or more verses where the Bible says God stretches out the universe. The picture is like unfolding a curtain or spreading a tent. The point is that the picture is always one of this unfolding and stretching out, which I think is very similar to the idea of the universe expanding. So, I read one verse of many. It says, he who made the earth by his power, who established the word by his wisdom and his understanding, he stretched out the heavens. So, we have this picture of the universe being stretched out and all the stuff being made at a point in time. And then we come to the next couple of verses. It says, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the waters. Now, we don't exactly know for sure what this term formless and void mean. It usually means waste and empty, okay? Not like formless, like a, apparition or something. It basically means waste, desolate, empty, uninhabited, nothing there in it. Now, if you look at the earliest times of the earth, the period between the earth's formation and about 4 billion years ago is known as the Hadean. This is a 500 million year period. Hadean is for hell, because they envision the earth as being a molten, fiery planet, that was inhospitable. I think that's very interesting, because that's what geologists named the Hadean, named that period. That's what they thought. But something's happened rather recently, and what's interesting here is the Bible said the earth is covered with water. So that's a real different picture, okay? So enter some recent data coming from what are called zircons. Zircons are crystals of zirconium silicate. They're tough as nails. They can be in rocks. The rocks weather, the rock crushes, and you still have your zircon unaffected. Incredibly tough thing. But more than that, zircons, when the crystal forms, they will suck up uranium into the crystal, but they won't accept lead. And so that makes them the world's really the best geochronometer, the world's best clock to measure time with. So one other thing about zircons that was so interesting is, there are several isotopes, different atomic weights of atomic masses of oxygen. And it turns out that you can tell from what isotopes of oxygen are in the zircon, whether it formed in a blistering hot environment like the mantle, or whether it formed in a cool aqueous environment that might have been expected if they formed in the ocean or, surface of the earth. So here's a couple papers that came out in Nature. From the uranium decay, they could tell that in one case, a zircon was 4.4 billion years old. And lo and behold, due to the oxygen isotopes present, it said that there exist oceans on the Earth at 4.4 billion years old. That's almost when the Earth formed. So we're looking at a short time after. Here's another paper by a different group. Their zircon wasn't quite as old, but it said the same thing, that 4.3 billion years old, there's liquid water on Earth. So I thought that's fascinating. So the Bible is saying the earth was covered with water. We'll get back to that in a minute. But then it says, let there be light. Now, let there be light is response to the darkness that was there. Now, some people talk about making disembodied light or light before the planets and all, or stars and all that. It's nonsense. The sun is out there. The stars are out there, and I'll get to that down the road just a bit. But for some reason, you're not seeing light on the earth. And there's a vent that happens that allows it to become visible. So what I'd like to show you now is something known as Mcneil's Nebula. J. Mcneil, is an amateur astronomer. And he was photographing the constellation Orion with his telescope and his CCD camera. And he was recording it day in, day out. And all of a sudden, a smudge here starts to appear in his images that wasn't there previously. And in fact, if you look at this, I hope you can see it's far back, and I can't expand it much, but sorry. This is supposed to play a movie, and it doesn't. Okay. So what you see here, this is Mcneil's Nebula. These are recorded over a period of days. And what happens here is a star is becoming much brighter. And it's through the reflection illuminating the nebula. And so the whole nebula lights up due to the light output from this one star. Now you might say, oh, that's a supernova, a big explosion. No, that star is still going today. And it's been going since then. It's fluctuating some in brightness. But that's sort of to be expected from a young toddler level star. So what we have to realize, I think, there's two things that are happening with that star as it's forming. One is, of course, it got brighter. I mean, you can see that. But the second thing is, as it does get brighter, more energy is being released, it blows away the surrounding material, and it clears the zone around the star. Now, it could have been that, that the nebula might have made it look like light was reflecting from all directions, but at some point it clears out. So this is my idea of the picture of Genesis one. And we have to realize, yeah, you're making that up. Well, maybe, but something like this had to happen with our star. In other words, it went through a sequence like this. And it's interesting that at the time the Earth forms is when the star is just about at the main sequence, starting to burn hydrogen. So I am speculating, okay? I grant you that. But I am convinced that something like that happened in the life of our star as well. And there were things that would make it get brighter, more luminous. That star may not have been able to be seen because originally that visible light would have been trapped. But the infrared will pass through the nebula, through the clouds and gases, the long wavelength light that causes heat. So it's interesting that we have liquid water on Earth near the beginning, and we could have had heat coming from the star without the light being seen. And then at some point, the light becomes more visible, in the visible range, and the zone around the star clears, making it more obvious what that source was. So after all of this, we get this term evening and morning one day. So this is the first day of creation. Now this is a subject of much dispute. What's a day? Is a day 24 hours? Is it a long period of time? And I'm going to give you two options from my perspective. Seminary professor John Collins says, well, these are God's work days, and time is simply irrelevant. It's undefined, let's put it that way. What a work day is for God, because it definitely the picture is God going out and working during the day, and then kind of going home at night and starting again the next day. But these are God's work days, they're not man's. I think that's a reasonable, and this isn't a thing that really bothers me a whole lot. But there's another approach. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a couple people, Gerry Schroeder and Sarah Salvi. Last time, in fact, I was up in this area, it was to drive Gerry from Austin to this area. And of course, we argued the whole way. It was great fun. Time really did get compressed. He's an Orthodox Jewish physicist. And he's written a book called Genesis and the Big Bang. And he has this crazy hypothesis. His idea is that time stretches out. And to make you can read his book, but to make a long story short, it's entirely possible for a 24-hour day from God's frame of reference to be billions of years from ours. You say, oh, that's crazy. Well, it's not crazy. Well, I thought it was crazy too. But there's a astrophysicist who at UT, a friend of mine, Sarah Salvi, who actually works on relativity and black holes and all that stuff. And she read Gerry's book and she said, you know what, he's right. That can happen. And in fact, Sarah tells a story about, she grew up as an atheist, never been to church, and she tells a story about how a Jewish physicist led her to Christ. Well, it wasn't exactly like that. She was thinking about maybe there's some purpose or rhyme or reason. When she read Gerry's book, she said, he's right. He's absolutely right. And that spurred her interest originally into Judaism. And then some point in her walk, she decided, well, why don't I go all the way and become a Christian? That's her words, okay? So Sarah basically agrees, and I respect her. I don't think she'd be at UT. She wasn't doing good work. So here's the idea. If you look at these two drawings, I told you space is being expanding. And if you took the space where we had light passing through at this wavelength, the yellow, and you stretched it out, the light would now be like that. Now, this is a shorter wavelength, and shorter wavelengths are in the blue. Of course, this is relative, but they're in the direction of blue. Longer wavelengths are in the direction of red. When astronomers look out in the universe, they see stars are red shifted. The elements are glowing and giving off light at certain bands that we know where they are, but when you look at galaxies far away, they're not where they're supposed to be. They're shifted in the red region. And so you actually can measure how fast galaxies are flying away from us by their red shift. Okay, that's how the expansion of the universe was first discovered and proven. But it isn't just light that gets stretched out. Time gets stretched out as well. And that, according to Schroeder then, is why a 24-hour day from one frame of reference could be a billion-year-old time frame in another frame of reference. So, I guess I would thought, oh yeah, there's always crazy ideas, but when Sarah really supported this and agreed, she said, it's not just that this is true, we have to take this into account in our work, or the work doesn't fit. So this is a very, very mundane point to her. All right. Day 2. So what I want to present is the idea that Earth had a steamy atmosphere as such for a period of time. And in this period of time, God says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. And he let it separate the waters from above and the waters below. So the picture is, there's all waters. Sounds crazy. Everywhere is water. And then we're going to make an atmosphere, I'll get to this, that separates the waters above, which are known as the clouds, from the liquid water below. So there's several important things you get out. First of all, the word for expanse in Hebrew is rakia, and it means to material that's been spread thin. So you could take metal and pound it out thin, and that would that idea of pounding out the metal thin is rakia. But you could take flour and grind it thin to dust, and that also has the same idea. Rakia is material spread thin, and it's what is used for our lower atmosphere. So I find several fascinating things about this. The first thing is that it's saying that the Earth has a secondary atmosphere. A primary atmosphere would have been the atmosphere that came with the Earth when it condensed. This is what used to be thought. The Earth originally had an atmosphere of methane and ammonia because that was what was in the stellar media. But there came a point where geologists said, no, that's not right. The Earth's atmosphere actually came later due to outgassing from volcanoes and from things in the Earth. And so that's what it's saying here. The atmosphere came after the Earth had formed, which is fitting the geology just fine. But it also seems to be saying water was everywhere, and the atmosphere separated the water from the water. And I would just quote you from an article. We think that the moon came from a big impact with a Mars-like planet right early in its infancy. And what was left over then became the Earth. And what he's saying is water oceans condensed from the steam after 2 million years or so, but for some 10 to 100 million years, the surface stayed warm about 500 K. Well, that's about the boiling point of water, and that could mean it's a pretty steamy place. So I find that interesting as well. So God says, let the waters now, this is day 3, be gathered into one place. So what I'm trying to show you here is that if the earth was covered with water, and right now the earth is covered, 70% of the surface is covered with water. If there were no mountains, if there were no ocean basins, the whole earth would be covered with water. And that kind of development of mountains and basins didn't happen until plate tectonics started. And we don't exactly know when that began, but it wasn't right at the beginning. You had to form a crust, and that crust, we have to build continents and stuff. And so in this idea then, before we had water on the earth, but we didn't have plate tectonics, the earth would have been relatively smooth and covered completely with water. So here's an article from McClendon in Earth Science Reviews, and he's trying to show what the earth would have looked like early in its development. This is a continent beginning to form, but everything else is covered with water. And if you'll notice what he says down below, he says, except for small areas, the whole world would be overlaid with ocean. So that kind of fits too. And so what we have in this next passage is God saying, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place. Let the dry land appear. Well, that has to happen. And he calls the dry land earth, and the gathering of water he calls seas. And this is what we expect happened. Now, the Bible doesn't give us a clue as to what went on to make that happen, but we do have a rather poetic description from the Psalms, and it says, so it's, it's poetic, not necessarily that technical, but you covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they hurried away. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place you established. Well, okay, it's a little stretch to call that plate tectonics, but the basic idea is there. We have production of the ocean basins, and we have mountains. That's due to plate tectonics as well. So I think that, again, is fairly similar to what the geology says. Now, the next part of this, the next 2 days are going to be, in my view, they are the most ridiculed passages in Genesis, and I think they're going to be the Bible's finest hour. So what we have in the next day, so God has separated, it says, the waters from the land, the dry land appears, and now it says, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them, and with so. So what you see when God initiates these things is something new that doesn't necessarily just happen all at once, and the imperfect form of the verb indicates continuing action. So when this verse says, let the earth sprout vegetation, The first thing it says is it uses sort of a word play, the noun and verb form of the same word, desha. So it says, it's like saying, let the earth sprout sprouts, or let the earth produce produce. That's what it says, as a command to tell the earth to start becoming green. The second thing that is talked about are eseb, which are herbs with seed, and the third is etz peri, which is fruit trees. So they are both expressed as participles, as dependent things that flow out from the initial command. We know that both herbs and fruit trees came late in the history of the earth, but what it's telling us is the command is given. God is in a sense the cause, but the action is produced by the earth. So there would be nothing unusual by saying we see the earth do this. Okay? It doesn't matter really what the steps were. It's that the earth does this, and we expect to find the source of it in the earth. Not necessarily anything magical. So what really happened at this time period in Earth? Well, I first want to point out this desha refers to often grass that sprouts up after a rain, but that's based on plants that we have now. And I want to point out something later on in Genesis, which is interesting, where God says to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the sky, to every thing that moves on the earth, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. What green plant is he talking about? It's not desha, it's esed. So if this meant to be grass, then why does it say, I mean, why are animals, of course, there's cows being referred to in the animals made, but they're not eating desha, they're eating eseb. So desha sounds like something different. Not at this point in time, not what the animals ate. Not the land animals anyway. So what we can see from science is the beginning of plants. But this goes way back, before there were plants. So I want to tell you about this story. The very first living things we can detect are carbon in rocks that are 3.8 billion years old. This carbon has been liquefied under high temperature and pressure. There's no way to know what it was. It's just streaks of carbon in layers of rock. But we can tell something about that carbon. And this is important to get this story. Plants take in carbon dioxide and they make it into plant. Plants take the carbon dioxide, make it into food. We eat the food, turn it back into carbon dioxide. That's the carbon cycle. But the thing is, plants don't like carbon dioxide made with the isotope of carbon C13. C13 is a stable isotope of carbon. Plants don't like it. They like carbon, CO2 made with carbon-12, the normal carbon. So we can look at the carbon in those rocks and measure the amount of C12 versus C13 and find, oh my, they're way distorted, much more C12 than C13 compared to the ambient environment. Therefore, they conclude that carbon must have come from living things. In fact, how do we know, for example, that the oil you pump came from living things? Well, this is an easy test. So we find a consistent history of carbon deposits from that 3.8 billion years on with distorted C12, C13 ratios, saying it's all living stuff. Now, normally, in our world, you fix carbon, you bring it in and turn it into plant by a process called photosynthesis. Minnick Rosen, who did one of the original studies, said these carbon deposits may represent photosynthetic organisms. This is in a Nature paper, I believe. But, okay, we can't tell, can't prove it. But if you go only a little while later, 3.5 billion years old, you see things called stromatolites. Stromatolites are mounds of bacterial mats that build up over time, and they're usually made from cyanobacteria. What are cyanobacteria? Blue-green algae. And so while we can't tell the oldest stuff, we can tell stuff not too much later that these looks like there's cyanobacteria. Now, cyanobacteria are photosynthetic bacteria, and at one point they took over the world. They spread all over the world. But more to the point, they become the basis of all plant life. The cyanobacteria become the chloroplasts in plants. So it looks to me like that is the origination of plants. They didn't come right then, but they come through this development that originally the chloroplasts are in the form of cyanobacteria. We know chloroplasts are like bacteria because they self-replicate, they make their own proteins and a lot of stuff. And every plant is characterized by having chloroplasts. So here's an article, I'm just quoting from it. Our results suggest that a free-living cyanobacteria with the capacity to store starch through oxygen, and you don't need to know about that. I'll get there. And to fix nitrogen would be very important intracellular acquisition, which, as can be recounted today from several lines of evidence, would have become the chloroplasts by endocytosis. Now, here we come to something even crazier. This is the craziest passage in Genesis. Maybe not. So, what this passage says on day 4 is that God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens." Oh, this is an important word. Lights where? In the expanse. What is the expanse? That's new. That was made earlier. That's important. So, it says God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, sun, the lesser light to govern the night, moon, and he made the stars, it says, and God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on earth. Now, I might sound like I'm contradicting myself. I said that the sun and moon and stars were made at the beginning. And now you're telling me they're made here. They're made after the plants. Isn't that crazy? It's the craziest thing I ever heard of. But wait. There's some important things here that you need to understand. One is there's a polemic going on with other religions. And it's important to reiterate here that, thank you. Can I have you a napkin or some paper towel? I don't know why you sweat. Sweat very easily, so it just looks crazy. Draining. Ask my wife. She says, "How could you sweat like that?" I don't know, maybe it's the extra insulation. Anyways, so it's important to point out that these are made by God. You know, Egypt worshiped Ra, the sun god. But the Bible wants to make sure you understand these are just things made by God. They're not gods themselves. And that's part of the polemic. So that's an important point. But the second thing is, what are the lights? What's the word? So it's what this text says. I think I have it a little further down. Now, it says God made the lights, but the word is not light. Or in Hebrew is the word light. This is meor. The light is what it's talking about is the visible source of where the light comes from. So it's not that there was no light, it's that there was the source of the light wasn't visible. You see the difference? You could see light maybe getting brighter. It's like a cloudy day. It got brighter and dimmer, but you never saw the sun. It would be like that. You didn't see the source. Meor is used for a candlestick holder. I mean, it's not the light itself. So, but you're going to tell me, oh, the text said they're made here, and well, no, it isn't. I want to show you how they wrote. And I wasn't the one who invented this. I got clued into this, not here, but on other places from Kyle's new commentary in Genesis. Excellent, wonderful commentary. And what he points out is how they use repetition to reconnect a story. And there's lots of places where this happens. And I'm not going to go off into this, but it's certainly something you can study. I'm going to just give you a real simple example. In Genesis 2, it says God planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. And then it goes on and discusses Eden, the rivers and the land, the gold, and blah, blah, blah. And it comes back to Adam. And what does it say? It says the same thing. Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate. 2 times he put him in the garden. Is that right? Is that what you think? Maybe Adam ran off and God had to go chase him down and bring him back here, you little rascal. No, this is just the way they wrote. They reiterate to reconnect something. And that's exactly what's going on when it says God made the sun, the moon, and stars. He didn't make them here. The word used to make is not bara. There's no creation going on here. He's just reiterating, he made them back then, at the beginning. But that's the old thing. Now there's a new thing. What's the new thing? Okay, the new thing is he now places them in the firmament. But you got to understand the picture. The firmament was new. That happened a couple of days ago in the text. And it could well be the firmament is obscuring the light, not the light, but the visible objects. Oh, you're just making that up just to get around the problem. No. That's why I say this could be the finest hour for the Bible, but we don't quite have all the data in. So, the idea here then is that we have an expanse, but it's not clear, and God puts them in the expanse as a way of saying they become visible in the lower atmosphere. They're still out there. The only thing new here is that they become visible in the rakia, the lower atmosphere. So why do I say that's not so crazy? There's a phenomena known as the faint young sun paradox. The faint young sun paradox was first brought up by Carl Sagan. It points out the fact that we have liquid water on Earth. We know we have liquid. We have sedimentation going on, sedimentary rock. But the Earth is between 1/4 and 1/3 dimmer back then than it is now. Earth should be an ice cube. The paradox is, why isn't the Earth an ice cube? But we know there's liquid water on Earth. So there have been various proposals to explain why Earth isn't an ice cube. One is water vapor and insulating clouds. So water vapor, I don't know if you know this, is a very, very good greenhouse gas. It's one of the reasons we could get a runaway greenhouse effect if we're not careful. So because as the Earth gets hotter, there's more water vapor. As more water vapor, it gets hotter. If it gets hotter, there's more water vapor, and blah, 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 blah. We go out of control. Kind of worried about that. Another possibility, carbon dioxide. That hasn't borne out very much. At best, there may be a 40 times greater carbon dioxide back then than now, but it would have taken 1,000-fold to really make it warm enough. That doesn't to be the solution. The third one, good possibility, methane. Methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And organisms were around that were making methane. The interesting thing is, one of the arguments against the methane model is it makes a haze. Just look at Titan. There's a methane haze that is somewhat limiting. And then finally, the possibility is a lower albedo. That refers to the reflectivity of the Earth. More light comes in and gets absorbed. We don't know the answer. But let me consider some options. Remember, I said these cyanobacteria took over the Earth. And they start pumping out oxygen. That's what they do. And for a while, the oxygen is being absorbed by the iron and things in the ocean, and then it starts elevating in the atmosphere. So about 2 billion years ago or so, we start seeing oxygen levels climb. What would happen if oxygen levels climb? Well, one thing would happen is methane would be oxidized quickly, and it would be turned into CO2, and the haze went away. Second, cyanobacteria use up CO2 to make the oxygen. So CO2 levels would have went down. And both of these things would lead to the Earth getting cooler. And if it gets cooler, the water vapor goes down. In fact, they think the rise in oxygen from cyanobacteria triggered an ice age on Earth. But if it were due to clouds and water vapor, that might have gone away. If it were due to a methane haze, that might have gone away. All of these possibilities represent ways in which the atmosphere could have become more clear and let the sun shine through. So I don't say this is proven. I'm speculating, I admit, but I think it's plausible and reasonable. And I think with time, we're going to know better how that works. Okay, next, day 5. God says, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. Right off the bat, we know from science is that life, animal life began in the ocean. Well, that's what the Bible is saying. Animal life begins in the ocean. It uses, again, this play on words. To them, it might not have play on words. To me, it's a play on words. It says, let swarmers swarm. That's the first thing. The idea of a swarmer is talking about the abundance, masses of life. And we call this period the Cambrian Explosion, where we see an explosion of life. So, Bible is saying the same thing. We have an explosion of life in the water. That's the swarmers. Then it says, let flyers fly. But this is also coming from the water. Now, this is an interesting word, oph and oof. The Hebrew verb and noun for flying things. The Bible translates in English birds. This doesn't mean birds. They had another word for birds, sephora. So it can be used for birds. I'm not saying it can't. I'm just saying this, if you look at it, Leviticus 11, you can find flyers include insects, birds, bats, anything that flies. They didn't use evolutionary categories, and we do the same thing. You know, I mean, we say a plane has wings. If anything with wings flies, right? So does that mean it evolved from something? No. They had a category of things that flew, and it didn't matter if they were an insect or they were a bird or bat. They just flew, and that's what they call oaf. So, but these oaf came from the water. Well, interestingly, we have in Genesis 2, 18, 19, birds that come from the land. And they're birds. These are flyers that came from the water. Well, we know flyers came from the water. Flying insects came from the water. In fact, what we know is that the insect their gills hardened and dried out and became wings, so to speak. I mean, that's the origin of their wings, comes from their gills. Even today, we know lots of insects that originate their life in the water. Mosquitoes, right? But there's a ton more. And that's what it's saying, that the first flyers originated from the water. Then there's this third thing. God, I don't know how they come up with this translation. God made the great sea monsters. Now this is an interesting. If you look at the Hebrew, it's Gedolim, Tananim. So a tanin is singular, tananim are plural. I'm losing my deal here. So just is good? So what's a tanin? Well, we know two animals in the Bible that are called tanin. One's a snake, and another is a crocodile. Okay? The interesting thing about these is they are the Gedolim Tananim. Gedolim means great. One form of Gedolim is Mcneil, means a tower. It's usually the highest point in the city. So I think you could honestly fairly translate this, the great reptiles, because our only examples are known are snakes and then there's things translated monsters, which I have no idea what they're talking about. But my point is, it probably extends beyond this, and it still remains true. The core meaning of tanin is elongate. So what this is really saying is the great elongate creatures. And at some period down the road, from the initial formation of life in the oceans, we have the appearance of great elongate creatures. But they're not just great elongate reptiles. They are the great elongate fish, the great elongate sharks, the great elongate amphibians, and then we end up with great elongate reptiles. Once again, it's the same idea. They don't have an evolutionary category. They just classify them as great elongate things. It didn't matter what they were. But it includes great elongate reptiles, obviously, because they call reptiles tananim. Okay? And it's plural. Gedolim tananim is plural. It's referring to lots of them. Lots of different great elongate things. Perfectly consistent with what we see. So, reiterating. The first thing, swarmers swarm. Abundance of small creatures explode. Second, flyers fly. This is the beginning of flyers. It's not the end. We have flyers coming from the ground later. This is the beginning of the flyers. And finally, the elongate creatures. Well, lastly, we come to day 6. What does it tell us? Well, first of all, God creates mammals. These are land, and he causes the land to bring forth the animals, the mammals. Not a lot in between there. It's not limiting. What do we know from science? Well, after the life in the land, in the waters, life came in the land. And then after the animals, we have humans. And they came later yet. So what you have is what I think is a perfectly consistent series of things that parallels what we think from the scientific account. Now, there's a very interesting thing here and there's much more. It would be a lot of fun to do Genesis 2 to carry on. But in Genesis 1, what he creates are male and female. And in a progression, at the end of chapter 2, you have husband and wife. There is a progression going on there. Secondly, God tells men and women to rule over the earth. Now, this has been more distorted than almost anything about what it says. But it says the word rule here is to put the kibosh on someone. You ever heard that term? What it's saying, and this is odd probably from everything you've heard, what it's saying is you're going to have to fight and struggle to survive. You're going to have to, the earth is not going to give in easily. It's not going to sit down and roll over. This is going to take strength on your part to overcome the earth. Well, we've done that clearly, but if you look at early humans, they had a terrible struggle. And so, all again, this is fitting the history we know. And so once again, I just want to reiterate, what I've done is walk you through the sequence of things in Genesis, and in most of the places, I admit I can't prove all of them, they seems to closely parallel what we see in the scientific history on the planet. So that's my story, and I hear there's people want to ask questions, usually. So.
We will begin now with Q&A.
First of all, I enjoyed your presentation, although I don't agree with it. Some resources, Reasons to Believe, is Hugh Ross's organization, and it's an old Earth view. And of course, the Answers in Genesis is the young Earth view. And then you have the Framework view, which nobody understands. But the best book on this subject is The Genesis Debates, 3 views, and it gives all 3 perspectives. Here's the problem. In that book, The Genesis Debates, 3 views, the key sentence in that whole book is, the cure is worse than the disease. The disease is a 6,000-year universe where you have the sun coming on day 4 and the moon and the earth on day 1, completely opposite of what science says. You have the plants, and I don't think they're talking about stromatolites. I think they're talking about real plants that on day 3 come way too early in the fossil record. Even Hugh Ross, in his Reasons to Believe organization, his own people say the plants are coming too early. There's problems all through Genesis. It's very complex and difficult. Now to the question. If you go to the Answers in Genesis Museum, they have, and you got up here, that the dinosaurs and humans, and in the Answers in Genesis Museum, you have humans riding dinosaurs. Do you believe that humans and dinosaurs were created on day 5?
Created on day 6.
I'm sorry, day 6, my bad.
The Gedolim Tananim are on day 5.
It's a day apart. Obviously, the scientific view is dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. The first Australopithecine that looks like humans didn't come until 6 million years ago. That's 60 million years apart.
Right, and I don't have any issue with that. Why? I don't think I said anything to imply differently. The Gedolim Tananim, the elongate creatures, start way back with the fish and sharks and amphibians. They all produce elongate, big, giant elongate. And dinosaurs are at the end of that, okay? But we even have mammals that would classify, like whales would classify as Gedolim Tananim.
But it's still a day apart. I mean, this is 60 million years
I tried to explain right up front.
Oh, that's right. You're on older, the long periods of time.
Well, it could be either that time is just simply undefined in the days, or you could go with Schroeder, which still has a 24-hour day to God being billions of years, millions of years. as the expansion changes, you have less redshift, less time dilation, days get shorter in his framework.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Marty, thanks for the talk. It was
Hey,
really
Zach.
interesting.
Good to see you.
So I'm wondering,
A little tart.
all this science looks really kind of cool, and I like how it all sort of flows together. I don't know that I can quite appraise the Genesis account in the Hebrew, but one of the things that struck me while we were going through this is, one of the other sacred scriptures that we know about there is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation account, right? And a lot of people, once it was discovered, noted how similar it was in structure and form to the Genesis one. And I'm wondering if you could comment on maybe whether or not the ancient Babylonians had some concept of evolution and cosmology in a similar way to the ancient Hebrews, based on the Enuma Elish.
Well, okay. So I'm not an expert on this. I do know something about it, but there are obvious parallels and obvious differences.
Okay.
The Babylonian and there's also the Assyrian accounts are full of monsters and magic stuff going on. Chopping a monster in half and it becoming birth or something. So, but you have to realize that the events that are being discussed predate the Babylonian and Assyrian accounts. Not only that, there's some interesting things in the Genesis frame there's what's called the Toldoth. And Weissman thought when he looked at tablets, there's a Toldoth at the end of the passage. Toldoth is a transition. This is a Hebrew word. But what it does is point to the next thing. So it's like, if you're reading a tablet, we only got part of the story. Where's the next part? So there's a Toldoth sort of pointing. So it was always weird why he thought that it goes at the end, but in Genesis it kind of points to the next thing. So my point is, it looks like you have in Genesis these genealogies. It's very matter of fact. Do you have that in these other creation stories?
The genealogies of the gods, yes.
Yeah, but not. There's a purpose to the genealogies that take you through to the Hebrew people. It goes to Jacob and his sons, and then stops in Genesis, but it picks up. These are matter of fact accounts, and it looks like they come from records. It's not a fairy tale. There are like tablet records. That's what Weissman thought. It's that they're showing the structure of tablets that were written as real records of people. So my perspective on what you're asking is these events predate all of those stories. And Genesis doesn't have the fairy tale elements as much as these other stories. They seem more corrupted. And there is, that's not a strong signature, but there is a strict signature that these are records that are handed down. Now, we know of a place called Eden. There's the plain of Eden. It's not a made-up place. And there were people called Edenites. So they're in the records, even with Adam. Adam is the first person really of record communicating with God here. But in the Bible, it says God placed Adam in the garden. But in the Hebrew, it says God caused him to rest in the garden. He didn't parachute in or get teleported. He came from somewhere. And that's where history ends. And it picks up with this person. And the Bible knows clearly there are other people besides Adam in there. So I see Genesis as a count that came through, and they branched out into other stories. They went through their own incarnations, and call it corruption or just whatever, how they embellish or change the story. That happens in everything. But it doesn't mean there wasn't a real account. We have flood stories all over the world. They're all different, does it mean there's no flood event that they all connect to, a real one? So I would say that, I mean, they're interesting and they do parallel, and they're obviously coming from some similar family tree, but I think Genesis is far more matter of fact and less embellished than any of those.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Hello, I'm Richard Evans from the Southwest Dallas Reasonable Faith Chapter.
Okay.
I really enjoyed what you're saying here. I understand that during the late heavy bombardment, several times the entire Earth's atmosphere was made up of superheated rock vapor.
Right.
And
Wow.
the most intense part of it ended about 3.8 billion years ago.
Right.
You mentioned evidence for the first photosynthetic life, cyanobacteria probably, about 3.8 billion years ago. First of all, does it match Genesis for life to begin 3.8 billion years ago? And do you see any naturalistic options for life, photosynthetic life developing between the last superheated rock vapor event in the late heavy bombardment and the time period that we have evidence for the oldest photosynthetic life?
Okay, I mean, that's a good question. It agrees with what I know from the science. But wait, don't go, because I'm not totally clear on the question. So the late heavy bombardment, based on studies of moon rocks coming from crater size and so forth, they're huge and then they taper off, but it's still not tapered off totally by 3.8. Right. Now, all those bombardments weren't all of the same magnitude. So some are thought to have evaporated the whole ocean, and others weren't so big. I mean, the craters are different sizes, right? And we only infer because the Earth's been remodeled, whereas the moon wasn't, and we can date the moon crater. Now, I know some people would say, and I'm not sure this answers your question, as soon as Earth could support life, it's there. In other words, this is an interesting point. There seems to be, if life didn't get started until that ended, that's a little bit speculation, that the window for life to arrive or show up is a very narrow window. And that window might be as narrow as 10 million years, which geologically is very narrow. So this idea of billions of years, it's not there. The record, as soon as life could have seemingly, from our current perspective, survived, it shows up. So does that kind of answer your question?
And from the point of view of an expert, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Even Stanley Miller, the idea of a 10 million year window comes from Stanley Miller, who did the work on showing the amino acids and stuff. It's not from a proponent. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
My name's Adam.
Hi, Adam.
My question's about the carbon-12, carbon-13 ratio.
Yeah.
How do we know the original ratio before life? So
we know what's ambient in the atmosphere, the distribution of inorganic carbon and what its isotopes are. That's the standard you compare to.
So the assumption is what it is today. The current ratio is what the assumption is it was back then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but you can measure what's ambient inorganic back then.
Right.
And you're comparing to back then.
Okay, so you're comparing equal things.
Yes. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, my name is Warren Beam. Thanks for coming tonight.
Hi, Warren.
My question is about abiogenesis, the spark of life. You think about if I have an ignition source and a fuel source, I can spark the spark of flame on demand. If you think about our research into trying to come up with theories on how life came about by natural causes, are we converging to an understanding of how it might have happened, or are we in fact diverging as we peel back the layers of the onion and see how complex even single-celled organisms are? I'd love to hear your thoughts about abiogenesis.
Okay, so we don't have a clue how life got started. A lot of research, some very clever research that in its own right is compelling. Where there is progress towards understanding how certain molecules we didn't think could be formed, okay? If that 10 million year window is right, it doesn't give you a lot of time, but it's worse than that. Because a guy named Shapiro has done some work. If you look at the base cytosine mutates to uracil very quickly. We're getting thousands of mutations a day in uracil in our body, but it's fixing it. So, you know, to now talk about these long periods of time seems a little silly when you know that cytosine without repair is going to break down with a half-life of hours to days. What's my perspective? No one knows how life got started. Okay, if you want a mechanistic explanation. My feeling is that God was very clever. He figured it out. But I still think it worked through processes.
So you think abiogenesis, that milestone, was still a natural milestone, but with God kind of behind the scenes setting it in order?
You know, I don't... Here's an important point from my perspective. I don't distinguish natural from what God does. Paul says, in him we live and move and are. And, you know, God takes credit for the rain. God takes credit for a baby developing in the womb, even though we know there's a, quote, natural program to these events. And like I was telling someone else, there's an old saying, if you want to know about water, don't ask a fish. So what happens? I mean, we're indoctrinated in this idea that there are natural processes, and that's not God. And it's only God if we see something miraculous or magical, that's not the biblical perspective. So when you say happen by natural processes, that's not my frame of reference. God works through natural processes and is working through everything right now. God is not equal to the universe or the earth. It's not pantheism, but he's in everything. That's what Paul says. So, but do I think that there was some magical event that just got life started and then all the rest? I don't think of it that way. I just don't have a clue how it got started. And I don't think anyone I know of, no one I know of really does. It's such a huge problem. It's such a staggering problem. And we're just whittling, you know, like teaspoons digging in the earth trying to get to China. The problem is unfathomable. But maybe there'll be some really clever experiments that show some possibilities. I'm always open to that. I just don't have a clue, and I don't think anyone else does right now.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi.
Dr. Poenie,
Yes.
thank you for coming out.
Oh.
I appreciated your lecture and appreciate that you made the trip and are engaging in this venue.
Well, thank you very much.
So it's much appreciated. It's been a little bit of time since I've swam through the scholarly world of interpreting Genesis 1. So I apologize if I'm a little rusty.
Okay.
But I was curious if you could speak towards the either compatibility or incompatibility of your perspective on Genesis 1 to the literary framework interpretation. The first gentleman, I don't mean to attack him. I think I heard him say that nobody ascribes to that. I might be one that is at least leaning in that direction. And when I say that, what I mean is that I think that perhaps the original author was using the 7-day week as a literary device to describe what God was doing, and also in a way to, you referenced it, combat the polytheism of the ancient Near Eastern religions in the area. Like you said, the sun is not a god. In fact, Yahweh created the sun, that type of thing. So to repeat, would you speak towards whether or not your perspective is either compatible or incompatible with the literary framework interpretation?
Well, I think the framework is an attractive idea, but and it could be construed as compatible, but not an atemporal framework. So when you see Genesis, it's written with these vav consecutive verbs, and God did, and the vav, as I understood from my Hebrew training, always has a consecutive, it may be a weak, hard to see, always has some consecutive sense to it. And the whole thing is written, this is the standard narrative style, with consecutive verbs. And it kind of makes me think it really is written with a sequence in mind. So, but I can't recall, I had some flash at some point about, of course, this is why it looks like a frame, and it just escaped me, I'm sorry. I wish I could give you a better answer, but I sort of land on the fact that, you know, it's written in a narrative style with vav consecutive verbs that just create this flow. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is more of just a simplistic question that maybe any layperson might ask, and that would be, why was the Genesis account created to so that now it's so controversial? You've got kind of two extremes kind of going at each other all the time. You have young Earth creationism, and then you have old Earth, whether it's creationism or just evolution and kind of, like the gentleman was saying, natural processes. Why do you think, in your opinion, that the authors of Genesis didn't come out and just plainly state what was going on to everyone?
I think they did. But to them, you know, to answer this, you've got to read this the way a Hebrew would back then, a Jewish person would back then, because the Hebrew is actually a pretty straightforward language. It's pretty utilitarian in ways. It's not like Greek, okay, with lots of nuance and stuff. But a lot of this is all background. The frame of reference you come from, when you read the same things and you come out differently. So the fundamentalist Christians that read in a woodenly literal way the English text, in a way the atheist group does the same thing. And they're not reading they're not trying to understand the way it was written and the meaning and the usage. A lot of people don't study. They read the English and that's it. And, you know, so there's just a lot of different paths. You know, when it says day, it means 24-hour day, and that's it. And you're not even believing the Bible if you don't believe that. Well, Schroeder has a way of seeing that doesn't bother him. It doesn't bother me, the age of the earth. But for someone who's think they're being true, they won't give up that idea for nothing. So you plant yourself in certain philosophical perspectives or ways of reading that that's it, you know. Some people would accuse me of being maybe an atheist evolutionist or just an evolutionist. Or this is not even an issue for me, you know. So I don't think it's the fault of the Bible. I think the Bible actually does a pretty good job of trying to lay out what's important for people, I mean, who have a sort of simpler, more primitive view of the world than we do. Okay, and so for a long time it wasn't an issue. It's an issue more now than it used to be for these people. So. Okay.
Okay, so my question revolves around the theory of the firmament. Are you familiar with the firmament
Yes.
theory? Okay. So
Well,
if you would, I'm gonna
refer to the rakia.
the Rakia problem. Okay,
expanse.
time frame. All right. So if you would, because I didn't know if you had enough time to expound on that. Could you expound in layman's terms to those people to explain the firmament theory, and in the same token, provide them an opportunity to explain how that may actually alter their mindset of how things could age faster or appear to age faster than it generally is, and put it in time frame.
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to as the firmament theory.
The firmament theory that I'm thinking about is where you have barometric pressure. They've already replicated this in scientific experiments where they take controlled oxygen, you have moisture above and below. So I'm talking about specifically pre-flood and post-flood Earth. Are you familiar with the theory that I'm referring to?
Well, yeah, there's no evidence for it that I know of. The firmament is the rakia, is material spread thin, and it refers to the atmosphere.
Right.
Okay, and it's where the birds fly, right? Lower atmosphere.
Right. Where you have barometric pressure, which will allow for more oxygen, so things at our ground level would be able to have expanded lungs. And things that, like the birds that you were referring to, or whatever life form that actually would be able to fly, would be able to coast.
Scientifically, there's no evidence for oxygen in the atmosphere. We're talking scientifically. A lot of this is made up. For the first 2 billion years of Earth. There's lots of ways we know that. One are called banded iron deposits. And the other is uranite. Uranite, if it were exposed to air, would quickly oxidize. Banded iron is seen in ancient deposits where ferrous iron, which is soluble in the presence of oxygen, oxidizes to ferric iron, which is insoluble, and it rains down. Our most productive iron ore deposits that we have are banded iron deposits. So this is evidence that there was no oxygen until about 2.5 billion years into the Earth's history. So I don't know what anytime there's atmosphere, there's barometric pressure. I'm not sure what you're referring to as far as oxygen goes.
Well, as far as controlled rate, that there was moisture above and below. In Exodus, it actually talks about how the Earth is formed up to that time. So it's talking about pre-flood. And then there's a description of what the Earth looked like post-flood. So if you believe that there was barometric pressure where something is controlled, the atmosphere is controlled, where you have moisture or water pressure above and below, that would, if you believe in what Scripture says, talks about pre-flood, there was no rain, according to Scripture, right? Moisture came up from the ground, according to Scripture.
Well, that's Genesis 2, but what you need to do is, once again, you got to understand the way they wrote. To say that this word, the mist, it's only used once in all of Genesis. We don't know what it means, really. But in cognate languages, it's referring to flooding. So the yearly floods of the Nile, which made the land fertile, that's in a cognate language. We can't understand what it means in the Bible. Based on, look, the way you know what words mean in the Bible is through their usage. There's no ancient dictionary to go to.
Right.
So if you have it only used one time, it's very hard to figure out what it's talking about. But, people who discuss that passage, the scholars, say that there being no rain can just mean it's not the rainy season. The notion that there were rivers flowing and no rain is somewhat incompatible. The whole idea of the water rising up could have been flooding, but you wouldn't, that's the most closest we get, but you wouldn't get flooding without rain. So, people have, this is a semi-contentious passage, which it's not clear if they're just in a dry area or if they're in the dry season, because if you look, what that passage says is that there's no rain, and then God brought the rain. And but why there was no rain? Like you're saying, there never was any rain before then.
Right.
There's
One could make that argument based on the previous scriptures. So when you get to that point, that could be the reason why everyone thought Noah,
Well,
a guy
it's
named
what
Noah,
it
was
sounds-
crazy enough
that's-
to build a boat.
That's what it sounds like in English.
Yeah.
That it never rained, but that's not what the Hebrew scholarly people. There's actually some very good articles out there discussing this very topic and what it means. Okay, and
So it almost sounds like it's something lost in translation from the
well,
translation.
It may
of-
not even be lost in translation. It's just a way of writing that this doesn't mean it's a big jump to say it never rained. It could be just the dry season, and God hasn't brought the rain again. Remember, God is always pictured as bringing the rain, so that's not something so special. That's what God does. I mean, I don't know. Gosh, if I could, I don't have it with me, but I have some references that it would be very good.
Okay. Well, thank you for expounding on it and giving people an opportunity, the layman who possibly never even heard that theory before, or at least that argument.
Yeah.
Opportunity.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hey.
Hi. Second question. I hope that's all right.
Okay, sure.
I was raised, I like the acronym BLEC, Biblical, Literal, Evangelical Christian, a fundamentalist Christian.
Okay. All right.
So every Thursday night, I grew up going out in door-to-door visitation talking about the gospel. So the first bookend of the gospel was the fall, and then the first Adam, the second was the sacrifice of Christ, substitutionary atonement.
Yes.
So my question is, how do you define the gospel? And two, does it involve the fall? And three, if it involves the fall, how do you reconcile an older Earth view with a literal Adam and talking snake story and the beginning of sin?
So that would be a whole nother evening to go through this, but let me give it to you shortly.
Thanks.
The Toldoth, translated, these are the generations of, or this is the account of, is the hinge in Genesis 2:4 between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The Toldoth, you can do a word study, always refers to what comes next. It doesn't sound like it when you read the passage when it says, these are the generations of heavens and earth, blah, blah, blah. But it never means it's referring back. So these are the sons of Noah. Noah begat Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Not how Noah came about, but what comes next from Noah.
Okay.
Okay, so there's the first part. Genesis 2 is not an expansion of day 6 of creation. It's what comes after the creation. That's based on the Toldoth. I just say, if you worry about that, do the word study yourself and convince yourself. That's part 1. So what we have in Genesis 2 is subsequent to the creation of male and female. Now, I absolutely do believe in a literal Adam and Eve, but there were other people at the time. Adam came from somewhere. In fact, I know this is too much to go through, but at the end of chapter 2, what does it say about marriage? And a man shall what?
Cleave to his wife? Or
Leave his father and mother. So if Adam was created presto changeo, and this is a commentary saying because of what, wherefore, because of what you just saw, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. How do you get that out of just presto changeo? The Bible says God caused Adam to rest in the garden. Well, Adam came from somewhere. I think he did leave his father and mother, okay? And he comes to the garden. God stops him there. Now, you have to understand, to get this, Cain, when he was cast out, he said, anyone who might come upon me will kill me. You remember that?
Yes.
But you can show clearly that there were no sons between Cain and Seth. So it was Cain, Abel, Seth. Why? Because when Eve gets Seth, she says, God has given me a posterity, a seed. She didn't have that. Cain was gone. Abel's killed. If Abel had a son, the next thing that you have to understand is Genesis traces the righteous line. It's pointing to the Messiah to come, but it's early in the game, right? The whole point. Her seed will crush the serpent's head. The serpent will bite its heel, okay? So there's two lines of people, those of the serpent and those of Eve. And like in John says, don't be of the evil one. Or Jesus could say, you're of your father, the devil, okay? So anyways, be that as it may, there's a line that's being traced. They're a very important line. And they want to, you have to understand the priority of the firstborn. Genesis can be organized based on the firstborn. So it's expected that the line will always go through the firstborn. This is very important. If the line doesn't go through the firstborn, it's a scandal. And every time it doesn't go through the firstborn in Genesis, you get an expanded explanation. Why is it not Ishmael? It's Isaac. Well, we get the story on that. Why is it Jacob, not Esau? Well, we get the story on that. Because it's a scandal, and it is a scandal. So you have to understand, if Abel had had a firstborn son, the Bible would not leave this out. Abel was considered righteous. The line would have gone through Abel. But that's not what happened. There was no other son between Cain and Abel. There might have been women. The Bible doesn't talk about women that much. So who is Cain worried about?
Were there, I don't know. It's a good question.
The Bible knows there's people out there. It knows. Now, how does that fit in with the gospel? First of all, the Bible never says that Adam was created eternal. Adam was created mortal. The way he could be eternal was through the tree of life that was blocked to him. Adam was going to die like anyone else. When it talks about death, I don't think it's talking about physical death. It's talking about the spirit that God that put in him. So Jesus could say, and Jesus and Paul are very consistent, Jesus could say, let the dead bury the dead, right? Well, wait a minute. We have living people that are dead, and there's dead people who are dead. Why are the living people dead? Well, they're fallen. But when the believer is dead, they sleep. Right? So Jesus tried to explain that to his disciples over and over. She's not dead, she sleeps. Well, if she sleeps, she'll get up again. Okay, you don't get it. She's dead. But he was trying to tell them she's sleeping because she's alive even if she's dead. Well, God told Adam, I know this is prolonged, in the day you eat, you shall surely die. Right? Solemn command and threat. It's a Hebrew double verb. Dying, you shall die. Now, what happened when they ate?
Right at the time they ate?
Yeah. Satan told them, the serpent, you eat of it, you'll become like God. You know, your eyes will be open, blah, blah, blah. That's the dying. And what happened? When Eve ate, nothing happened. Then she gave to Adam, and he ate, and it says, the text says, both their eyes were opened. So what Eve didn't, nothing happened to her when she ate. when Adam ate, both of them got the same thing. So what am I saying? The effect of Adam's sin doesn't just spread vertically through time. It spread laterally. It spread from him to Eve. Even though Eve was never given the command. Eve wasn't there to get the command. And when she ate, nothing happened. When Adam ate, he was the guilty one, and it spread to Eve. They're both guilty. They both hid from God. All the things that... So when God said, in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. When they ate of it, something did happen, right? It was a physical death.
That's what I was taught growing up. That's what I was taught growing up.
No, they didn't die physically. In the day they ate of it, something happened. But they didn't die physically. Adam lives another 800 years.
Right, not at that time, but that's when physical death was introduced. I
But
think
I'm
that's
telling you, he promised them in the day you ate of it, yes, day could mean a longer period of time, but in fact, the moment Adam ate of it, it did happen. Right then and there. But it wasn't physical death. But it was separation from God. It's kind of a long detail. That's why I said it would take a whole nother evening. So, yeah.
Evening, Doctor.
Yeah.
Just a quick preliminary question to ask a follow-up question. You believe that Adam, or the first humans, were created through evolution, not through a creation of God. Is that correct? What I mean by that is I just want to understand.
I don't think evolution and creation by God are different things.
Right, I understand.
I'm saying there's a history.
Right, yeah.
Okay? However it came about.
Right.
I don't believe in its point mutation and selection. But God could... There are all kinds of amazing things that took place in the history of life.
But from like a Neanderthal to a human, or something to that effect is your position, correct? Is that...
Yeah, there's a history. Yeah. You can see this history. Okay. You clearly see it. Okay.
My final question is really about the Imago Dei. Where do you place the Imago Dei in that perspective?
Okay. Yeah, this is a very good question. It's a really good question, really hard question. Well, the male and female were created in the image of God. Okay? That, to me, predates Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were from that group. Okay? So they, of course, had the image of God, too. All right? But here's the deal. In Genesis 5, it says Adam had a son in his own image that was Seth. Okay? Now, what does it mean that he has a son born to him in his own image? He's a baby. Can't talk, can't probably think about much, doesn't look adult. Does he still have the image of God?
Seth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he doesn't look like Adam. And I'm using image in the same term. Seth is in Adam's image. And Adam's in God's image. Okay. But my point is, when Seth is born, does he look like Adam?
Obviously, we have no idea. I mean, presumably, yeah. In terms of humanistic characteristics,
no, but he's
that would
a
make
baby.
sense. Yeah,
he's a baby.
Yeah,
he can't feed himself, right?
Right.
He can't do math. He can't speak, right? He's a baby.
Right.
Does he still have the image of God?
Yes.
But he grows up into something more like what we think, right? The image of God.
Yeah.
So Irenaeus, one of the church fathers, thought of Adam and Eve like being like children. And what I'm trying to say is, can you grow with the image of God? I mean, is it all perfect, full-blown in an instant? And I would say from Seth being born in Adam's image, he has the image of God, but it's not fully developed, whatever way. I mean, even the Jews, they have a bar mitzvah, right? An age of accountability. There's a progress there where you become responsible. And I see the image of God as something that could grow. And so people people.
So your position is image of God is a state of development, like
What I really believe, the word image is the same word as idol. And if you look at how idol is used, people, that's exactly what idol means. It's an image. The real essence of image is having the ability of God to dwell in you. That's what they thought when they made idols, that God could come and live in the idol. They would come and feed the idol breakfast, wake it up, thinking that the God is living in them. So I think that there's a lot been written about image, but I think at the heart of it, it's the ability to have God dwell in you. And, well, it certainly elevates man to a status above, right? But I think just like a baby has the image of God when it's born, humanity could have grown. In other words, a Neanderthal or whichever line might not look what you're thinking of the image of God, right? But it's part of the progress. So that's my perspective.
Thank you.
Dr. Poenie, I'm back.
Okay.
And I'll try to make this quick. A lot of the attacks that I see from non-Christians, from atheists, people trying to undermine the Christian worldview, when they speak towards creation or Genesis 1, most or maybe all of the interaction that I have with those people, I walk away feeling like they just have really oversimplified and just kind of taken a very surface level, sometimes even silly, sometimes simplistic understanding of what Genesis 1 is trying to communicate, and then use that as a way to attack the truth claims. So my question is, whose fault is that? And the reason I say that is because I walk away from that experience with the atheists and I see my own community, people within my own community, perpetuating that idea. And I don't mean to attack anybody here or create stereotypes. I guess what I'm trying to, what I'm asking you to do is to implore us to really study and think hard about these things rather than kind of take the most easiest and simplistic path and either believe that and perpetuate that idea or attack it. And shouldn't we all be going deeper into really what God's trying to communicate here?
Oh, absolutely. But, there's two parts to that. Pastors are supposed to be doing that. I mean, Peter writes, let the what's the word used? He says, basically, let the pastor be worthy of double honor, meaning twice the salary, for those who labor hard in the word and doctrine. So, Paul, when he talked to the Bereans, he called them more noble, because when they heard the message, they went and studied to see if it was right. And he called them more noble. Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, pastors should be doing this. That's first and foremost, and they're not. I know a lot of pastors couldn't read in the original language, and they say all kinds of crazy things, but they're often more concerned about entertainment. So what do? I mean, I think they should be doing this. Yes.
All right, well, thank you.
Are we done?
Last question.
Okay.
How can we pray for you, your family, and your serving at the Poenie Science Lab?
Oh, my. We're trying to do research in the lab. We always need that support. We're trying to write this into a book, and I never have the time, it seems. There's so many things. Chris graduated with her PhD in education. She's trying to find something appropriate. So, and I think just that this could get out there.
Thank you.
Dr. Martin Poenie.